Alright, so we did our project on the book All Souls. The author is Michael Patrick McDonald. It's about his life growing up in the neighborhood of South Boston, and pretty much touches on everything from crime, poverty, drugs, and weapons. And he currently resides in Brooklyn, New York. He's actually going through all the struggles that he went through growing up. He actually wanted to do something better to give back to his community. So he ended up becoming an activist, and one of the things that he did was start a gun buyback program in South Boston, which actually purchases the weapons to get them off the street to save kids from getting killed. His mother was a really important part of his life. She had a huge family. She was a single mother her whole life, so she really had to play like a big part, and she really played a big part influencing all of her kids and really setting an example for how they should live and how they should kind of act in a sense. This is a neighborhood that he grew up in, which is Columbia Point. This is actually on the South Boston Dorchester waterfront. They had a really harsh upbringing. They were a white family and mostly black development, and back then racial rivalry was a really big thing, so that played a huge part. And so here's the next neighborhood that they moved to after Columbia Point, which was kind of a relief of stress for all of them, because after growing up in Columbia Point, this was more of like an all-white project on welfare, and pretty much it was just easier. It was easier for them to not have to deal with a lot of things. Poverty played a big role in their upbringing. She was on welfare. Pretty much the whole family was on welfare, and they were paying like $65 a month to live in the apartments that they grew up in. So they never really had much money, and they kind of all just really had to play a big part. It was a huge family. He grew up in a huge family with 11 kids total. Though they had a lot of good times, there was also a lot of bad times. Tragedy played a huge part in their upbringing. 4 of the 11 kids actually ended up passing away. So in the early 90s, Ma finally got out of the projects in South Boston and moved to Colorado with their son Joe, who actually joined the Air Force. He was kind of like, he played a big role in getting her out of there and actually finally getting the family out of the projects. A big part about Southie is the sense of belonging. Like, everybody felt like they had like a really close ties and great bonds with everybody in their city. You always had a sense of being like protected and kind of watched over, and really they just ignored all like the crime and poverty, everything.
So we're going to rewind a little bit. This is Columbia Point, where UMass exists today. Back then, Michael lived on Monticello Avenue, which was predominantly a white neighborhood. Columbia Point was called high crime rates and referred to as a mostly black development. Back then, his older brother sibling, Davey, had to protect his younger siblings at school with a lunchbox. That's how serious it got. Back then, the busing crisis was going on. A lot of riots were going on. It was basically, as Neil referred to, black versus white, white versus black, as well as the corruption of law enforcement. Everybody just hated law enforcement in Southie, which is code of silence. And then we got into the drugs. The drugs started piling into Southie, but people knew who it was. 2 of Michael's siblings got affected, which was Kevin and Joe. They got into drug dealing, which affected most of the family later on. Davey, the oldest, he was a schizophrenic. He developed that issue as he was growing up over parenting issues. Frankie, who was a prominent boxer and a friend of Davey, they got along, they built a strong relationship over time. After then, Frankie got arrested because Kevin got blamed for drug dealing at his mom's house. So Frankie was shipped off to the Navy SEALs. After then, Davey fell off the roof. Soon after then, Kathy did as well, which is one of his siblings. After then, she did survive, but there were a couple visitors that visited her. But after then, there were tragic deaths that affected them, but nobody knew what happened exactly. They either got strangled, shot, or beaten to death. This comes back to Sally and his code of silence. Everybody has that strong pride and power, but everybody just really kept to themselves, which is a really injustice to all the deafs around the community. So here we get back to the drugs again. Later on, Kevin, he was in and out of jail for drug dealing associated with Whitey Bulger, as you know. Later on, Frankie, he got really heavily into cocaine just because Davey, his brother, died. And he was pushed off the roof, so that really pushed him to depression. Nobody knows what happened. He was a part of a robbery, but we will never know the light of what actually happened to him because they actually found him with strangle marks around his neck, even though they said he was shot. So we come here to Notorious Whitey Bulger, which is the gangster of Sally. The protector, they call it back then, because they kept a sense of community back then, pretty much. But he was the one who got the drugs and the crime pushed into the neighborhood. Years down the road, Michael found a way out, but he chose not to leave Sally. He became an activist, like Neil said. He bought the gun buyback program, as well as his family got out of Sally and they moved to Colorado.